All right, so now that we've allowed our users to share and unshare their notes with other users, the next thing that we're going to do, right, the last thing that we're going to take a look at here is how to add another section to our application that will allow users to see all the notes that have been shared with them, right? This will say something like shared with me. And it'll use the exact same component that we saw up here. Well, it'll use a similar component as we'll see, since we won't have the delete buttons, obviously. It'll use the same component though, and we'll just have to add a setting onto it. Okay, now there's a few ways we could go about this, and each one, of course, has its benefits and drawbacks. But what we're going to do for the time being, just because it's easiest, is add this logic to the initial endpoint for loading notes for a given user. So essentially what we're going to do is, let's open up our list notes route. What we're going to do in this route is, instead of just sending back only the notes that belong to that user, right, that the user owns, we're going to also send back the notes that have been shared with that user. So in other words, instead of just sending back a single array of notes, we're going to send it back in an object like this. So we'll say something like owned notes and shared notes or something like that. And then we'll just have to modify our notes provider slightly to take that into account. So what this is going to look like here, we already have all of the notes that belong to the user, so we can call those something like owned notes. We'll change that name just to make it a little bit more self-explanatory. And to get the shared notes for a user, this is actually fairly straightforward the way that we have it set up currently. We're going to say const shared notes, or you know what, let's call this something else. We'll call it shared with user notes, right? Not the most poetic name, but it does its job here. And the way that we're going to query those is we're going to say await notesdb.find. And what we want to do is find all of the notes whose shared with property contains this user's email. All right, so we already have our auth user up here, so that means we have access to their email. So what we're going to do is we're going to say find shared with auth user dot email. And what this will basically do, MongoDB will automatically detect when this is an array property, and it will convert this to mean something like authUser.email is included in that array. Right? So we're saying shared with should contain authUser.email in order for a note to be returned. So that'll give us the shared with user notes. And then we just need to convert this to an array by saying dot to array. And let's send these things back now to the client side by saying response.json. And we'll send back just what I showed before. We'll say owned notes, and shared with user notes. Okay, so now we need to open up our notes provider component here and change the way that we load our notes just a little bit, all right? So first of all, we're going to need to add another state variable to our component here because we have the notes that the user owns. The other state variable that we're going to have is, we'll just call it, I guess we'll call it shared notes, right? That's a little bit ambiguous, but just in the interest of not creating these huge, nasty variable names, we'll say shared notes. All right, so, and then we're going to have set shared notes, and these are both going to start off as an empty array. And we're going to want to also return shared notes or provide shared notes from our notes context provider here. So we'll say shared notes. And that basically means that whatever pages need this are going to be able to access it via the notes context. So all we need to do now is modify how we're getting this data from the server. So we're saying const notes. We need to change that to const owned and shared. It's like we were sending back from our server endpoint. And what this is going to be, we're going to say set notes to owned, and we'll say set shared notes to shared. All right, so that should take care of everything for us, assuming that we've done everything right so far, which is a rather large assumption. But nevertheless, let's head over to our notes page. And basically, we're just going to display another notes list using those shared notes instead. So first things first, up here where we're getting the data from our notes context, we're going to say is loading notes, and we're going to get shared notes as well. And then down here, we're going to add another notes list. We'll add it below our add a new note thing, I suppose. Well, first of all, let's add another H1 heading. We already have my notes, so let's call this one shared with me. And for this one, we're going to do something very similar to what we did up at the top, where we said there are currently no notes, add one, except instead we're going to say there are currently no notes shared with you, okay? And we're not going to say add one because there's really nothing the user can do in this case. So there are currently no notes shared with you. And then below that, of course, we're going to add another notes list component. And the notes for this one are going to be the shared notes. And on request delete, we're not going to add anything there because we don't want anything to happen. On click item, we will allow the user to actually see that note. So we'll just say on click item. And that should be all we need to do. Let's test this thing out and see what updates we need to make, if any. Okay, first of all, let's test to make sure there's no syntax errors. It doesn't look like there are. So let's go back to here and try reloading. And of course, there's not going to be any shared with me notes currently because, we haven't actually shared any notes with this email. One thing, though, that needs to happen, this needs to show that text underneath it, and it's not doing that because we didn't change this to shared notes.length, right? We just left that as what we copied and pasted from above. So anyway, we see there are currently no notes shared with you. So if we want to see some actual shared notes, let's make sure to share some notes with someone. All right, so we're sharing it with jane@gmail.com, so we'll go back to our notes and share another note with Jane as well. So jane@gmail.com, click share. And now let's log out and log back in as jane@gmail.com. Okay. And we should see those shared with me notes in the shared with me section that have been successfully loaded. And if we click on these things, we're going to see that it says, uh-oh, looks like that note no longer exists. Now, the reason for this is actually somewhat of a deeper problem, but there is a fairly quick fix for this. The reason for this is that when we're getting the note by ID, let's open up our note detail page to see that here. When we're getting our note by ID, we're only taking into account the note. So if we want to find that note in the notes and shared notes, what we could do is say shared notes. And then we could combine our notes and shared notes by saying notes, shared notes, and using the spread operator there, which combines those two arrays into a single array. And, then we would have to do that on all of the other pages as well. And, now this should work. If we go back to our page, right, we see, does this work? This note currently has no content, which is actually the correct content for the note. Now, one thing that you'll notice here, which is what we're going to have to make some changes to later on, is we're going to have to make it so that the share button and the edit button aren't visible when the user doesn't actually own the note. And more specifically, we're going to be seeing how to add permissions to our sharing because, maybe we do want another user that we've shared a note with to be able to edit it. In that case, we would want them to see this edit thing. And maybe we want other users to be able to share our notes with other users. In that case, we would want them to see this share button as well. So there's lots of possibilities here, obviously, but in general, we're going to need to hide these things for users, which means we're going to have to add some more logic. And that's something that we're going to take a look at a little later. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.